Hi, I'm Serena Halstead.
Hello, I'm Mellisa Smith.
And I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to Data Lake. And we are at the midpoint of our Working with Data series. So before this, we've looked at some of the concepts of data literacy, and afterwards, we're going to have a number of different interviews with Wake County staff. Now, as we transition, though, I want to talk about two of my favorite things, education and baseball. How are y'all feeling about talking some baseball today?
Uneasy, but I'm willing to do it.
Let the game begin with education.
I like it. I appreciate you having this conversation with me. Baseball is one of my favorite sports, one of my favorite things to kind of learn about. And one of the things I love about the game is just the role that statistics plays in the sport. I think, and us working in the data research and accountability department, that's a parallel, I think, to the jobs that we have. And I think looking at the history of baseball can perhaps, or there's at least my pitch, and we'll see as we talk, but can perhaps inform us about how we look at educational statistics or data as well. So we're going to start, and we're going to talk a little bit about baseball, then we'll make educational connections as we go through. So baseball, do either of you have a guess how old baseball is when it was invented?
No, but I know I've been playing this from ever since a child, so in the 80s. So I'm going to go back maybe 10 years before the 80s.
I'm going to say the 1800s.
Yeah. So it's there's a lot of different stories. And we should mention that you two did not grow up in the United States, so your relationship with this sport is going to be a little different. So this is going to be a fun conversation. You can stop me when I'm geeking out too much over baseball.
We had something similar called rounders, which is kind of like baseball. That's the closest thing that we can come to.
Yeah, there are ancestral kind of connections between the two as the game kind of evolved in different spots. And there are probably apocryphal stories about like around the Civil War and Abner Doubleday, a soldier in the Civil War, kind of inventing. So it's a really old sport. And throughout all that time, there are certain statistics, certain data sources that have become kind of predominant. And so like in the 1870s, they come up with the stat of batting average, which is essentially just how many hits per at-bat. So if you're at bat 3 times and you have 1 hit, your batting average is 333, you know? And so 1870s goes way back. We've been relying on that ever since. Likewise, around 1879, a Buffalo newspaper came up with the statistic of runs batted in, or RBIs. This didn't become an official stat till the 1920s, but it was kind of always a part of the game. And it is essentially if you're at bat and you get a hit and someone scores on that hit, that's an RBI. What you want to do is score runs, so it's a good thing to count, to measure. And another important counting stat is home runs. Right. So you hit the ball over the wall, or it could be inside the park, and you get to score there. And really, home runs leapt into the public consciousness with. Actually, can you think of who the most famous home run hitter?
Babe Ruth.
Yes, you got it. So Babe Ruth.
That's the only name I know.
Nailed him. I'm proud of you, Mellisa.
Nailed it.
So before him, the record was like 27 home runs in a season. Then he hits 54, then 59. And then with that, all of a sudden home runs kind of became a much bigger deal. So, we were talking about going back to the 1870s, these three, batting average, RBIs, and home runs. And on the pitcher's side, we can say earned runs average. It used to be that pitchers just pitched the entire game. To the point where early pitchers, they weren't even really trying to get the ball, the batter out. The batter would tell them where they wanted to throw it, and they would just kind of toss it there. But eventually, they started trying to actually retire them, and so you come up with the idea of earned run average, ERA, which is looking at how many runs a pitcher would have given up if they pitched the entire 9 innings. Oh. So if they give up, 1 run in just 3 innings, that's an ERA of, 1, 2, 3, 3. So those 4, we could go deeper, but those are kind of these stats that have been around for over a century now and have just become the standard counting stats, the standard data sources. And as a result, since those are the ones that were counted, those are the ones that were valued. People that have those specific skills are the ones that would get paid and promoted and get playing time, all that. People with other valuable skills that contributed to a team winning, but maybe weren't measured there, they weren't noticed as much.
Okay.
So what do you think might be some educational connections, educational similarities to this era of baseball statistics? Melissa, I'll start with you.
So I think it makes me think of ever since we've had sort of these federal or state or local guidelines and accountability systems, there is a great reliance on achievement scores or achievement data. So that was the thing when you were describing those different measures. That's what I was thinking in terms of education. Like, what have we been relying on over time? And I think of achievement data.
And so for me, I'm thinking about just the classroom standards, the educational standards that are set for different curriculum standards. And so I'm thinking of, for example, in mathematics, you might have one standard being more elevated than the other. And even though the other standards are important, at the end, there are some more assessment questions that are coming in on a final exam. So I'm thinking about all of those different things that you mentioned, like the home run and the RBIs. And the one that stood out to me was the home run. Like, yes, after all of these things that you've assessed me on, this is really what counts. So the home run, that stuck out in my head. But yeah, I associate that with the different standards within a curriculum, and that some standards are more elevated than others. And these standards, when it comes to even getting jobs, employers looking for specific things that you have done in a particular field of study.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's where my head went to as well. There's some of the standards and the standardized tests that were meant to measure them. And I was looking back, just curious, the history of education statistics with baseball. And kind of the name that jumped out here was an 1845 Horace Mann. Whereas before him, it was a lot of oral exams as a way to kind of gauge what people knew at the end of a unit of instruction. But instead of annual oral exams, and we'll drop an article for this in the show notes, he suggested that Boston public school children should prove their knowledge with written tests. The goal to find and replicate the best teaching methods so that all children could have equal opportunities. But this kind of got taken and changed a little bit over time, where a lot of, like with World War I, the Army Alpha and Beta test, which was used to sort soldiers, and a lot of these other tests that we're looking at, a whole bunch of people. What do we do with them? And the article that I looked at, mentioned that unlike Mann's exams, many of the first widely adopted standardized school tests were designed not to measure achievement, but ability. So going back to the idea of kind of Hattie, of placing a label on someone. So these early standardized tests, they made me think of, like batting average, do they tell us something? Yes, absolutely.
Right.
But do they tell us everything we need to know about what someone can do? Well, no, they weren't necessarily intended for that.
Right.
And that's a note of similarity that I felt like between looking at baseball player, just looking at their average and RBIs, and maybe looking at students just looking at their one kind of standardized test. But these data sources are useful, but we can't rely on them solely.
Right.
So with baseball, there's been this kind of statistical revolution, this embracing of analytics, of new data sources, new statistics, be it a stat like on base percent. So whereas average is looking at how often you get a hit and get on base is saying, be it a hit or a walk, either way, if you're on first base, you're first base.
Right.
Or something like slugging percentage, where slugging percentage is the total number of bases that you get per at bat. So if you are at bat 3 times and one player gets a single, another player hits a triple for the one hit, their batting average is the same as 333. But the slugging percentage, the single, that's 1 out of 3, so that's 333. Whereas the triple, that's saying that's 3 out of 3, that's 1,000. So it's able to measure, some hits are more valuable than others. And on base is looking at, well, who cares how you get on base as long as you get on base. And it starts to give you this profile of players that can contribute in ways that otherwise wasn't measured, and finding value there. Recently, there's some really interesting statistics based on StatCast, which are these high-tech cameras around every single park now, which can look at, what the mile per hour of a hit, the launch angle of it, to look at the probability of a hit. So you have stats like expected average, which is saying based on that profile, based on how hard you're hitting at, what angle, those kind of things, was the likelihood getting into these kind of underlying skill. So there's been recently all these new statistics that have been embraced, and it's really changing the game. What do you think might be some educational connections for some advanced, for some newer stats, data sources that we're looking at? Serena, what do you think?
So I think I had my ideas down when I started listening to about Bill with the ability. We're looking at the ability of how the player is able to control the bats and make those runs. But then I'm listening to the other things that you've said, and I'm hearing diversity. Diversity in the sense that, for example, in the classroom, yes, the curriculum standard, the core that students are supposed to learn, be able to do. But there are other things about us that makes up the profile. I'm thinking student profile now and that diversity of their profile. And there are many things that goes into the student profile. So apart from academics, think about the 4 C's. Is the student able to collaborate? Is the student able to communicate? Is the student creative? I'm thinking about all that you just mentioned, and it is that diversity about that student profile. At the end of the day, when you present that child, the child is not just about core academics. There's more that makes up this child that is going to be entering into the working world and assuming a position within teams. Everybody on our team has different talents, different skills, different know-how. And so what are these things that we're looking at when we are, educating the child? Are we addressing the different things about the child that will make them to be a productive citizen in their workplace and in the world?
I love that. Mellisa, what are you thinking for educational connection?
So for me, branching off of what Serena just said, it's that look of what we've been hearing in educational fields, social and emotional learning. There has been some emphasis on that prior to the pandemic, but I feel as though coming out of the pandemic, we're hearing more about social and emotional learning. And that describes the skills, the attitudes, and the behaviors that can affect student success in school and in life. So like Serena mentioned, with the 4 C's, you're looking at critical thinking, emotional management, their conflict resolution, their ability to make decisions, teamwork, all of those sort of things that add to who they are. Well, like we've been talking about, their ability as a student, like what can they do is more than just, can they do math? Can they read? It's all of these things come into to play. And so it's interesting when I was looking up on this, that it says that under the federal law, the Every Student Succeeds Act requires that states can decide to account for social and emotional learning happening in their schools and to use that data to make decisions about how to best support schools. So it's interesting that even at the federal level, they're seeing a need to not just have accountability systems that look at the core subjects or the core academic subjects, but also giving states that flexibility to include those aspects into their school accountability models. And we're seeing that change. And I'm wondering now, even though the emphasis on social and emotional learning has been on that sort of elementary pre-K level, there are some states that are developing K-12 standards for social and emotional learning. So I think this is a growing field, and I think we're going to see more and more towards that end.
I like that. Yes. And it's something that you even see in the sports world with athletes like Naomi Osaka starting to talk about how important social emotional learning is for them as well. Ultimately, be it a student or a baseball player, a tennis player, we're all humans.
Right.
The human part impacts what we do. One other new data source that has kind of caught my eye has been just the data of what kids are doing before and after they come to us in Wake County. So be it pre-K data, looking at especially kind of equitable access and what impacts some of those things have, but also post-Wake County data. So National Student Clearinghouse is doing some really interesting work there. But just, what are our students coming in with, and how can we use that to make sure that every student has an equal opportunity? And then also, if our goal is to make sure that our students are college and career ready, then we have to kind of see how they're doing in their college and their career. So I think those data sources that we're starting to look at a little bit more will be really interesting to see how they develop over time.
I agree.
I can't help but think about how we're recording this and talking about baseball statistics at a time right now in December 2021 when baseball's in the middle of a work stoppage.
Right.
So there's kind of an irony there. And, some people make the argument that part of the reason for that work stoppage is actually this newfound reliance on analytics, is some of the use of some of these new data sources. USA Today wrote a piece talking about this work stoppage, And they have in their line, a quote, players feel that their earning power has been marginalized by over-reliance on analytics. That essentially these new metrics are being used harmfully when applied to kind of player contracts, some of those kind of things there. We're not here to take a stand on the baseball work stoppage.
Right.
But I do think this brings up the question of, what should we keep in mind when we develop new educational data and roll those out so that it is being used to help, not to hinder our staff and students? What do you think, Serena?
So as we are, as Mellisa mentioned, those social emotional data, and I'm talking about the 4 C's, what the new data sources that we're looking into, just being mindful that not everything that gets measured is important for the task that we are trying to accomplish for the child, or what the child is going to accomplish in the end, right? So we're not shifting away from academics in terms of that we're going to measure the academic standards. But as we consider the new data pieces that evolves around the child, we need to be mindful that there are specific federal, state, local guidelines that we must adhere to. And while we're adhering to those, we want to make sure that these new measures that we're taking in, I would maybe say what percentage are we giving to it, right? We don't want to undermine I would maybe refer to academics data as that basis for everybody, that starting point for everybody. We don't undermine that. That should still be there. But then maybe we should consider how much are we elevating these new data sources over the basic starting line that each child should have certain competencies by a certain time. So definitely being careful as to what are we measuring and how much are we taking that new measure to influence the decisions that we make for children.
I like that.
That made me think in that with the new measures that we all just addressed, so there's not a problem in having more data.
Right.
The policies or the pressure that school accountability policies put on us requires to have more data, to look at more data. But I think while we have more data, we have to be careful in how we use the data. I think your example about what's happening in baseball made me think about use of data is something that we can improve on. I think in addition to having more data within the educational world, I think we need to look at how can we improve the use of data, because having more data is one thing. Using the data, we kind of said that in previous podcasts. Using the data, I think there's more for us to learn and consider in how we're using the data. And so one of the things that I try to support is, again, the teachers, making sure that data gets back to teachers, right? Teachers are in the trenches using the data with our students, and they are creating data. Our students are creating data. Decisions and data tends to kind of get away from teachers. They're creating it and they're part of that process, but then it kind of goes away. And how can we make sure that the data involves the teachers, making sure that they're involved in the reflection process and how data is used, how it could be better used, making sure that the teacher and the student, not just students alone, but teachers and students are at the center of our data use.
I like that, Mellisa. And just listening to, as you said, the different data is evolving around us. Also, that communication piece that you mentioned, putting back the person, for example, the students is at the forefront of it all. But then how are we communicating among ourselves? Because the last thing we want is that Mellisa has this understanding about this student based on this new data that we're now looking at. And then another teacher has a different understanding. So that communication piece and making sure that we have that shared understandings about what is it that this new data that we're tacking on to what we currently have, are we all having that shared understanding about what it means for our students and how can we help our students move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Data should make conversations clearer, but if there's a lack of data literacy, if people are using terms differently, then it's going to have the opposite impact. And yeah, my head was in the same spot, just what is the data used for? So Mellisa, you talked about, it needs to be used to improve instruction. It needs to be in the hands of staff and students to make school work better. And I thought about how, conversely, when data is used, going back to our conversations on Hattie and our feedback series last year, when data is used like feedback on the identity level to tell people who they are, then it can be really detrimental and hurtful. Especially as we're looking at new data sources that might need to be kind of like anything else, refined year to year. We need to make sure that we're not using it to apply labels to who people are. My other thought with what it's used for is this idea of Goodhart's law, that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. When we measure something to try to become more informed about it, but then when people manipulate what they're doing, when they manipulate the instruction because they're just chasing this data source because it has been put on too high of a pedestal, then all of a sudden we're not really measuring what we're trying to measure. So those are two things that I think about that we should be careful about as we develop and communicate new data sources. Had some baseball talk today. And I could talk baseball all day, but that's probably not what our listeners want to talk about. So let's land this plane by bringing it back to some kind of practical takeaways for teachers that are listening. So what do you think might be some takeaways for teachers? What do you say, Serena?
Looking at multiple data source is good, but collecting multiple information for, our students, the multiple doesn't necessarily mean that we are collecting quality, right? So I would go back and say, yes, multiple data source, it is needed to give a full picture of what is going on with our students, but making sure that that multiple that we're collecting, it's quality data that we're collecting about the student.
I like that. Quality data. What do you say, Mellisa?
So I think as teachers, we need to invest in ourselves as data consumers. I know for me, a lot of my data literacy skills I got probably outside of the classroom in this role. And so, when I work with other teachers, we typically don't get training on data literacy. And so I would propose for teachers to invest in your own data literacy skills, because in order for you to make sense of current data, new data, you kind of have to understand it. And there are a lot of concepts, right? And so my thing would be invest in yourself, invest in data use, the understanding of it. It's more than just finding averages, which for me, for a long time, that's kind of where my data literacy was. If I am able to find the average, calculating my grades, but it's so much bigger than that. And so I would say invest in data. Invest in your own understanding of data use.
That's good.
Yes.
Yeah, and my takeaway is just that stuff outside of education can, I think, inform our industry. So just as in baseball, some of the stuff comes from people with degrees in mathematics and impacting baseball, we can look to other areas, other industries, and use that to improve the systems that we have within Wake County. Be it on a macro level, like the giant systems, but even just on a personal level, you can look at your other interests and say, like, oh, what can I take from here to make me a better teacher or administrator or central office employee, whatever it might be. All right, well, thank you. Did I make you guys 2% more baseball fans? Go from 0 to 2%. Okay. I'll take. I'm not paid by Major League Baseball, so that's fine. All right, and thank you, listeners, for joining us in our conversation about what baseball can reveal to us about educational data. And we'll be back in a couple weeks with some interviews with some Wake County staff to learn more about how they work with data to improve instruction for students. And if you have any questions, comments, requests, you can reach us as always at www.wcpss.net/datalit. And thank you to Cary High School student Logan Foster for the music for today's episode. And we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.